Perfect, thanks. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Alec Smecher, and I'm the Associate Director of Development for the Public Knowledge Project. And I lead a group amongst the dev team called the Dev Leads Group, and we're trying to present more in this kind of audience about the sorts of features that are coming to OJS in the next releases. Normally, we start to prepare our documentation and publicize what's coming right at the end of the release process, but we're trying to share more about what's coming throughout that process. So you'll see a few of these meetings, these presentations coming up as we get in the cycle of making visible what we're working on between releases more often. Today, I'm going to be talking about preprints and continuous publication in OJS, which is a feature of major interest to the community at large. As you can see, we've got a number of folks here. We've already presented this a little bit within the Dev Leads webinars, which we do on a quarterly basis. And this was made possible by the OSS ORE project. That is a major focus for us for this release cycle for OJS 3.6. And it's funded by the European Commission for us to make available a whole new suite of features, including the preprint workflow in OJS. So special thanks to them. I'm going to talk about a few different related features here. So there's a few slides that I'll start with, and bear with me on some of these details here. I want to set the stage for a demonstration of these features in OJS, but I'd like to kind of give you the motivation behind them before we do that. A number of these issues, you can see by the low numbers on some of these issues, they've been filed for quite a long time. 4,860 is quite a long time ago. And then some of the newer ones here, you've got these 5-digit numbers. This is just to say that this is features that have been of interest to the community for a long time, but that we've not been able to attach to a particular version or resource for development until now, thanks again to the European Commission. The first of those is what we've been calling version types and summaries. And this was an idea that we could take the existing versioning tool set in OJS, which allows for us to publish version 1, version 2, version 3 of an article when it's revised, and expand that outwards into including different types of versions and different summaries to describe them. This is to say that you would be able to describe what version 2 was. Is it a major revision, a minor revision, in a more standardized way? And we've been able to expand that to include a standard called NISO JAV, Journal Article Versioning, which is something I'll talk a bit more detail about in just a minute. The second of these features is early and continuous access to publication. And this, largely speaking, is to take the assumption we've always had in OJS that every published piece of content is going to be attached to an issue and say that's not necessarily the case. We want to be able to allow for content that's been submitted to be posted early before it's scheduled into an issue, and also to undertake continuous access, which is to say publishing outside of the issue. I'll talk a bit more about that workflow in a second as well. And then a couple of small details here, arbitrary depth and categories. This is a chance to expand the thematic organization tools when publishing in OJS. For folks who are not publishing in issues, they typically will want to organize their content into thematic areas, areas of study or maybe funding sources, that sort of thing. And this allows for better organization of those thematic areas using the categories tools that already exist in OJS but have not been developed out for broad use. And the last one I'll mention is stage workflow for preprints. This is just a number of different tweaks and small modifications to the workflow to permit a preprint workflow in OJS. I'll talk briefly about each of these in a bit more detail, but I want to say before I get into this feature here, one question I often get is about the relationship between OJS and OPS, given that we're now pursuing a preprint workflow in OJS. And just briefly, we will continue to maintain OPS and run it alongside OJS. The use cases are a little bit different. If you're running with OPS, then typically you've got a large preprint server that you're accepting content into without the intention of publishing it as a peer-reviewed article in the same institution. So if you're running a subject area-based archive, like it's geographical, or maybe it's for physics or law, then typically when you have the preprint published and finished, that's where it's left with that hosting organization. And if you do want the authors to take and publish that content in a peer-reviewed journal, they would choose a journal of their own choice and publish it elsewhere. Now, the preprint workflow in OJS is much more of a unified piece. So if you're running a journal and you want to start to experiment with preprints, that'd be a better use case for preprints in OJS. Just to say that because we're adding preprints to OJS does not mean that OPS does not have a future. We'll continue to maintain it. And there's actually some features here that get added to OJS that will also be added in part to OPS as well. So there'll be some improvements there. One theme I'm going to mention here, and I'll go over this in a bit more detail later, is that whenever we add a a new option for the workflow, we have to ask ourselves, how do we allow for editors to configure that new option? And it's really easy for us to take a straight ahead approach of just saying, well, if there's a new option, put a checkbox in setup that says enable this or disable this. And we know from OJS 2, now many years ago, that if you just continue to add new options to the setup, then the setup becomes really hard to understand and to manage. And it also leads to a lot of different code paths that become hard for the software for us to maintain, just knowing that we need to test all those different pathways and make sure they continue to run. So in this case, we pursued a design philosophy of not adding any configuration for the workflow. So you'll see a bit later on that we tend to add some new possibilities for editors to pursue when working with a submission, but we don't have any central checkboxes in the setup to be able to say, yes or no, we do want to have preprints, for example. That gives us a lot more flexibility and keeps the software a lot more maintainable. I'm going to spend a bit of time on each one of these different issues now, these different areas. The first sidebar is the current ORE website. And just a quick summary of what's happening with the OSS ORE project. Basically, there is an existing Open Research Europe website, which looks like this. It is hosted on F1000, and so it has some of the typical features if you've worked with F1000. One of those is that the workflow is transparent, and you can see a summary of the review process presented here. This particular article has two different versions. There's version 1 and there's version 2. And you can see the reviews on each of those. We had 5 reviewers assigned initially, and all 5 of them said, I approve with reservations. And then the second round of review, we have 2 approve without reservations, just straight approvals. And that's what, in this case, is the threshold for this article to be considered a published peer-reviewed article. There's a bit of a quirk here, which is that in the F1000 model, something that was, let's say, a preprint that then receives 2 approvals suddenly becomes a published version of record. And within the NISO Journal Article Versioning Working Group, this is kind of a tricky subject. They've been trying to work with a number of different stakeholders, PKP being one of them, F1000 being one. I believe Elsevier is also there, Springer, and so on trying to find a standardized way to refer to these different versions. And of course, all the different tools have slightly different definitions of workflow. And this issue of being able to suddenly have something that was a preprint become a peer-reviewed version of record is one of the quirks that F1000 has to work with. We are not going to adopt that workflow into OJS wholesale. And the presentation of the content and things are going to, of course, be similar to what we see here, but we're not going to just take what F1000 does and duplicate it within OJS. But we do have to be able to incorporate as we launch the new Open Research Europe project on OJS with this data. Essentially, the project is a data migration from F1000 to OJS with a lot of new features being added to OJS to accommodate that. We have to make sure that we can accommodate the data that's coming. So we'll have to find some way of having this workflow be possible in OJS. Just to point out, though, that there is this view of the open review, and you can see elsewhere in the system that there's this kind of iconographic view of what the submission's been through. So at a glance, you can see what's happening. So we'll be adopting some of those things within OJS. You'll note, by the way, that there's no indication really of what the revision was unless you go into the contents of the reviews and take a look at them. We're hoping to do better than that. And one of the ways we're doing that is by adopting the journal article versioning terminology, which is the next thing I'll talk about. So the NISO JAV standard defines workflow stages that are intended to standardize communication between vendors. The idea is that we want to be able to have a standard definition of different terms to refer to what a submission is, and then a way of talking about the versioning of it as well. This is not a fully standardized, finalized standard. There are a couple of parts of it that remain a bit contentious, and my understanding is that they're very close to wrapping up those details. And when they do, we'll of course accommodate the changes to make sure that the release that goes out in OJS 3.6 is the NISO JAV standard terminology. One note about this, though, is that you'll see when it comes to the demonstration that some of the terminology that we use does come from this standard, and in all likelihood, you won't have run into it before. My hope is that the major vendors will be able to adopt this standard and use it so that in all of those software packages, readers, editors alike will become familiar with these terms and understand what they mean. This is the problem that NISO JAV was setting out to solve in the first place. But what it means is that at the moment, you won't probably have run into these terms, and it might seem a little bit confusing thinking that readers will run into these as well. That I expect will change if this standard is successful in being able to pin down those terms. Just to look quickly at the standard, there's this set of terms here, which is the ones you'll see in the demonstration. Long story short, the relevant terms for us here are the author's original, which is essentially a preprint. It says right known as a preprint if deposited on a preprint server, and then version of record. And this is what you'll be talking about if you're doing a traditional peer-reviewed journal or article workflow. So we'll see those terms in the demonstration. The NISO JAV standard also defines semantic versioning, and that's in section 2.5 of the standard here. If I just scroll down to that, you'll see basically it defines a versioning methodology where you have a major and a minor revision number. So let's say you have a version of record is published. That'll be version of record 1.0, which is to say it's the first version of record. If you were to make a major revision to that, it would become version of record 2.0. If you were then to make a minor revision to correct a typo or something like in an author's name, that would be a minor revision. Therefore, you go to 2.1, and then 2.2 would be a second minor revision. This is borrowing from semantic versioning concepts in software in general. And I hope that this is going to help to encourage the use of the versioning tools in general. One of the troubles we have in OJS is that since we introduced those in OJS 3.2, I think it was, editors have been really hesitant to publish revisions. And I think this is because going back to print publications, it just wasn't a common practice. And I think what's going to happen, coming from a software background myself, is that editors should, if the tools are right, become more comfortable with the revision process, and it'll allow for proper tracking and transparency around how an article changes over time. So adding this addition of a minor, being able to designate something as a minor revision is very important, I think, because for the most part, the practice that editors have been following is if they see a typo, they unpublish the content, they make the change and they republish, which is really a kind of an anti-pattern. It's not good behavior, but it's what normally is done in academic scholarship. I'd love to see that change. So if this is your invitation to use the versioning tools in OJS 3.6, then so much the better. But I think it is a good standard, and my kudos to the NISO JAV team for sticking with it and wrestling with this question of language. Okay, just a bit more on no configuration, and I will demonstrate this in a second too, so thank you for bearing with me while I talk. This is a quick summary of the different scenarios that we want to be able to support using this preprint workflow in OJS. And you see there's kind of three different major scenarios here. I may want to schedule an article for an issue, but still have it available in advance of the issue's formal publication. I may want to use the issue scheduling as an organizational method for when I have a lot of articles awaiting posting. I may or may not want to designate an issue at all. For example, my journal may organize content through thematic areas, such as categories, and have no use at all for issues. That's the Open Research Europe model of things where there's no issues at all. Or I may decide to publish, for example, quarterly issues based on some of the content that's been posted early. This may mean going through already posted content and publishing a formal issue based on things that have already been made available online. For articles, this will probably mean that previously issueless content will now have an issue. And of course, all of the underlying tools like DOI stuff need to behave predictably, regardless of the mix of the above. So we have here three very different scenarios. And you can imagine too, if you are a journal that's doing traditional publication and you want to start working with continuous publication, then it might be that you have some content that's still using issues and some that's not. So rather than allowing for all of this to be chosen through some complicated mix of checkboxes where, let's say, some sections might allow for continuous publication and some might not, some types of content might allow for it, some might not. We just want to basically give the editor the tool to choose on an article by article basis what they want to do, and then get out of the way for them to be able to pursue their work. So that'll be clarified a little bit in the demonstration I give. There's kind of three ways in the OJS homepage of organizing content now that we're introducing this. This is the one new setup option that we are adding to allow for folks to organize and publicize content the way they want to. This is basically just a way of choosing what you list on the journal homepage. Do you include the current table of contents? Of course, if you're using issue-based publication, that's what you'll choose. Do you include the most recent published articles? If you're doing continuous publication, that's what you would choose. Or if you're doing thematic organization, you can choose a list to add a listing of categories to the homepage. And so because those are all checkboxes, you can do any mix of the three that you want. I'm going to give now three demonstrations and have plenty of time for question and answer. So there is a Q&A tool that you'll have on the Zoom. Please feel free to add your questions, and I will get to those after I've done three demonstrations. The first demonstration is going to be a traditional issue-based publication process. What I want to do here is I want to show you what OJS has always done, but I'm going to show you how it looks in version 3.6, which has a number of small changes, and set the stage for us to sort of step off that pathway into some new workflow pathways afterwards. So the first demo is traditional issue-based publication. The second is preprint-based publication. And the third is no issues at all, thematic-based publication. So I'm going to go into my demonstration install. This is a pre-release version of OJS, which is to say that it may or may not work, but hopefully it'll be good for me for now. And I'm going to find a submission that is fairly late in the workflow process in my list of production stage publications. Any of these will do. So I'll choose this article here, Reason Reclaimed. And I'm going to just review a couple of changes here that have come in since you've last seen OJS. The major change here, this is all similar to the OJS 3.5. So if you've used 3.3, a lot of this will be new to you, the new submission listing, the workflow appearing as an overlay here. Those are all included in 3.5. But one big change here that's written for 3.6 that you will not have seen before is the move of the versioning tool set from the top bar here over into the sidebar. So previously, if you had multiple versions, you would have seen a drop down here where you could choose version 1, version 2, version 3, and then view and modify, let's say, the title, the abstract, maybe the contributors list for that specific version of the submission. We've now moved that onto the sidebar here. So this is the current version of the article we're looking at. And it says here unassigned version. And this is one thing I want to talk about in a bit more detail because this relates to the fact that OJS doesn't yet know whether this is a preprint or a version of record or something else. But it does need to know what the title and abstract is. We have to have a contributor list. So think of this like a container if the metadata lives inside, including things like the galleys, the published content, the PDFs, the HTML, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do for this traditional workflow is just show you what it would look like to schedule this in an issue and publish it. So essentially what we'll do is the same as we always do. We go to schedule for publication. We're going to choose now a publication stage. This is where we designate what this article is. We're going to say this is going to be a version of record as for example, a peer-reviewed article. And here's where you choose whether it's a major or minor revision. Because this is your first and only version, it can only be a major revision. So there's only one option there. We're going to say we want to assign this to a current or back issue. And I will choose volume 1, number 2. Confirm the settings there. This is a confirmation page where right now there's not much to see here beyond just confirmation of what we're publishing and where. But if you were doing DOIs through Crossref and so on, you'd see a bit of a summary of that next step there. I'll publish it. And you'll see that if I go into the publishing front end, here it is. And it says here now that it is a version from this date. It is a version of record. This is the JAV terminology, and its version number is 1.0. This is scheduled into an issue because we're doing traditional issue-based publication, and there's not much else to see. You can go to the home page, and you can see most recent articles. This is the current table of contents. And if I was to go into the dashboard and find in the journal settings, if I wanted to change that setting about what you see on the home page, sorry, I believe it's in website actually. There it is. If I want to have a listing of categories for thematic organization, which of course you can mix and match into this, then you choose that here. And you'll be able to see, just like in OPS, the list of the main categories, subcategories, and so on. Be able to browse content that way. So that is the traditional issue-based publication. There's a couple of new fields on the publication forms, but otherwise nothing much has changed. You can continue to do your work without thinking about it more than that. The second workflow is a preprint workflow. So I'm going to go ahead with this and start with a submission that's just come in. And I'm not going to change any settings here. So if I go to editor dashboard, look at a brand new submission somewhere. Let's say we choose Rossi. So here we are yet again with a single version. It's called, again, the unassigned version. And I'm going to want to start with this as a preprint and then mature it into a peer-reviewed article using this new workflow. What I'm going to do first is use this new button here called Schedule for Publication. Previously, OJS used to have you walk through the peer review process, through copy editing, through publication, and only then could you schedule for publication. And now it's possible for us to do this right from the outset. So I'm taken into my version. I can review the title and abstract and so on, and I can schedule it. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this is an author's original. It's a preprint. It is, by definition, it's got to be a major revision because it's the first and only version. And we're going to not assign this to an issue. This is now continuous publication. Confirm that. Confirm my options here. And we'll see that if I go to view that, it is now published as a author's original, as a preprint. So without further ado, I could have uploaded my HTML, my PDF, And this would now be published online as a preprint. And OJS knows that it's an author's original version and not a version of record. So any deposits that require things like a peer review to happen first, for example, it would not be subject to those. If I go back into the workflow, let's say I'm now going to put this through a peer review, and I'm going to walk through the traditional publication workflow where I've got review process, copy editing, production, and then I'm going to post a second form of this article as a published version of record. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is create a new version. Again, you can think of this like a container for the metadata. We want to allow for the new version to evolve separately from this existing version because this one's already posted and should not be edited. So we'll create a new container for this new version. Your title might be different, your abstract might change. There's a lot of reasons why you might have your preprint form different from your published version of record form. So now we choose which version we copy metadata from. We only have one here to choose from, but if you had several different versions, you could imagine you might want to base this new one on an older version. And we're going to say that this is going to become a version of record. And again, this is the JAV terminology that you'll become familiar with, hopefully, as the standard gets more adoption. This again will be a major revision because it's in a new stage, so there's no way of having a minor revision since we're changing from an original version to a version of record. Okay, so now we have the two versions here in the sidebar. We have the author's original version, the preprint version that is, and we've got the version of record that we have not yet published. And this is where we'll be doing our work. So the next thing we're going to want to do is go back into the submission workflow and send this for peer review. We have our usual email-based workflow where we communicate with the author that this is being accepted for review. And then I won't go through this in great detail, but you could, of course, assign your reviewers here, work through the peer review process, finally accept the submission, notify the author about that. Again, fast forwarding through the stages, go through your production process, your copy editing process, and your production. And what will distinguish typically your preprint form and your final form is the preprint will be rough and ready, but you're going to want to, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The preprint will be rough and ready. It might just be a Word document. It might be a PDF. But then once you've gone through the more fulsome process of doing the publication process for production, you'll end up with a much more polished PDF, copy editing, all that kind of process. So I've just, while I was talking, I clicked through to the publishing form. This is the last step here. So we're going to want to now designate, review and designate what this is. This is a version of record. It is a major revision. And now we choose what our issue assignment is going to be. And we're going to want to do traditional issue-based publication on this one. So we'll say that this is going to go into volume 1, number 2. And we're going to confirm that and publish. So just to review quickly, what we have now is two published versions. There's the author's original here, which I can expand, and we have the version of record. The author's original is not published in an issue. You can see that here, not assigned to an issue, but the version 1 version of record is assigned to an issue. So if I look at that in the publication front end, I'll see that there are both versions here listed. By default, I'll come in, if I browse to it, to the most recent version. But I can also view the older versions of the submission. So I can see here side by side the version of record, the peer-reviewed version, but I can also go back to the preprint if I want to, and I'll be given a warning to say this is an outdated version. The important thing is that we have in both cases an indication of what it is, what version it is. And if I look back at the version of record, this is in an issue, so I can also browse that issue by issue. But the preprint form is not. The preprint is not designated in an issue, and therefore there's no issue presented here. Let's say I wanted to go through and make a minor revision now, make a third version. So I'll go back to the workflow. I'll do this very quickly, create a new version. This is based on the version of record 1.0. It's also going to be a version of record, and this will be a minor revision. This is the first time I've been able to make this designation here because this is the first time I've had an existing version in the same stage that we can use to revise. So I'll confirm a minor revision. I'll make a small correction. I'll save that. I'll publish it. Again, I can review this information. This is going to be in the same issue again. Obviously, it's a bit weird to be publishing a revision in the same issue, but you can think of this as maybe a correction that goes into a subsequent issue, but we'll go with this for now. And now this has become, I think you saw there, version of record 1.1. So now we have 1.1 indicating a minor revision, 1.0 indicating a major revision, and then back to the preprint form in OJS. There's just one last thing I want to demonstrate, which is no issues at all, a thematic form. So I'm just going to go behind the scenes here and clear out my database with a couple of quick changes. And I want to highlight here that this is what I'm talking about when I say that there is a no configuration approach. So I've just gone through and removed all issues from this installation. And if I go back to the workflow, I'll go into content where we moved issues into, and I'll see that there are now no issues at all. And the one change I want to, one demonstration I want to make is that if I now go into the workflow, let's say we choose something that's late in the publication stage, production stage, and let's go through and see what it looks like when we try to publish this. Essentially, you see that the form is much simpler now. Because there are no issues created, OJS intuits that you don't want to use an issue-based workflow, and therefore we just hide those fields. So we can incorporate all the different options you want to have, but if it's possible, we can simplify those down so that we don't present any fields that are unnecessary. So this is what I mean by the zero configuration approach to things. All right, so some implications I want to talk about what's likely to change with this release of OJS and what's likely to continue to change in the future. This is the first time where we've had a really different workflow status versus publication status. The publication status is to say this version of this article is published. And the workflow status is to say this is the status of the submission in the workflow queues. And just to make that a bit more concrete, we know that these are published. Sorry, this is the one I've just been working with and it is not yet published. But if I go to the demonstration I gave earlier, I think that was, yeah, this one here. We know that all three of these different versions are published. So the question is, which of these queues should it appear in? And obviously everything's done, so it's published. But if you think about a workflow where you've got, let's say, a preprint that came into the system and got posted, it's not at all clear from the workflow queues whether that should move now into needs reviews or whether it should move into published. So we still have some work to do to clarify that sort of thing. But the difference that I'd like to point out is that the publication status refers to an individual version of an article, and that's fairly clear. That says it's published or it's not. The submission status is now the question of which queue it appears within. So I think we're going to give the editor tools to send the submissions to the right place based on knowing their own workflow, rather than, again, having configuration that's going to probably get some options wrong and not satisfy everyone. There's the points 2 and 3 here, I'll talk about both at the same time. Essentially, when we talked about publications before in OJS, they were always peer-reviewed articles. And now they might actually refer to preprints. So we've had to do a lot of work, and I'd like to thank, in particular, Bojana on the dev team has been wrestling with this quite a bit, with the question of, now that there are preprints in OJS, are we making sure that we don't treat them like versions of record by accident? So this is a question of things like, are we depositing into Crossref, informing Crossref that we now have potentially a preprint, or are we just dumping everything in there, assuming it's all going to be version of record? A lot of tricky footwork there to make sure it gets done correctly. Some next steps to talk about. So as I say, finessing submission status is the next step for us. We have to make sure that we get that correct so that submissions end up in the right spots in the queues. But there are two really exciting things I want to mention here that are coming next. You'll notice I didn't ever deal with a PDF or an HTML file. I just went ahead and showed you what the article landing pages look like. What's missing here is anything readable beyond the abstract and title. Obviously, when you work with this yourself, if you've been using OJS in the past, you'll know that you need to upload your HTML and your PDF galleys and so on into the galleys section. But what we're introducing with 3.6 is a typesetting workflow that's going to allow for the body text editing directly in the workflow. This is a very active part of development right now, and I won't show you anything at the moment, but very soon you can expect a demonstration that will show what it looks like to typeset your articles in this process and no longer have to go outside of OJS to generate PDFs. It'll also make HTML-based publication possible for a lot of folks who previously couldn't do it because they didn't have the resources, and an export to HTML from Word, for example, was too painful. So that HTML workflow will become available to folks who have not had it before. And then theming. Obviously, this is a very basic introduction of a couple of things to your traditional OJS theme that just add some more information. This is the version of record, and here's the version number, for example. But we are doing work on theming both infrastructurally to support better, more maintainable themes, and also for the ORE theme. And we also have a very rough design for a next generation theme for OJS that we'd like to include as a new kind of default theme. So a lot of these things that we're introducing here are going to really get a good workover with the ORE theme first, and then with this new default theme for OJS. That has not been scheduled yet for a particular release, but we are prioritizing it and hope to be able to tell you more soon about that. I think with that, I'm going to move over to questions. So I'll stop my screen share and we'll see what folks have in the Q&A tool. Once again, the Q&A tool is a great place to ask questions, but I will try and go through questions in the chat.
Let me know if you want me to read anything out, Alec.
I can see them here, actually.
Okay, sure. They're mostly in
so
the
Ronald's
chat.
asking, go ahead. Yeah, that's good. So Ronald I saw a back to copy editing button. Will there also be an option to go back to review for a new version of record? Yeah, I think 3.5 added the decision reversion tools. And so it's possible to go backwards in the workflow starting with 3.5 already. That's not new for 3.6. So it should be possible to do that with any submission in 3.5 already. So that's a yes. Another question, can you assign a DOI to the preprint and then another different to the published version of record? Absolutely. That's part of what's included in the specifications for ORE, and that'll be included in 3.6 as well. And again, that's a lot of work that's being done by Bojana and others on the dev team, and it's hard work and they're doing it well. So that'll be, I'm hoping, very satisfactory. Question, how can we ensure that the latest version of record PDF will be harvested and distributed in third-party services, for example, in Google Scholar? So the short answer to that is that a lot of the indexes that we're dealing with don't yet have good provisions for versioned content. Google Scholar is a little bit agnostic to the publishing system. And so they ask us for things like they want us to have the language in the URL, for example. And we've done that to make indexing better. But essentially, it treats OJS like a web page. And when it crawls OJS to find out what content's there, it looks on various pages for various meta tags. And so if it does happen to crawl OJS and there are two different versions, then it'll find the meta tags for those two different versions separately. What should be added to the Google Scholar tag list is support for the journal article versioning standard, the JAV standard, so that it can then receive that machine-readable descriptor of what the article is and say, oh, this is a preprint, I know what to do with that. And then maybe cross-link those. But I don't think the Google Scholar meta tags yet have that under consideration. And so how it treats those in the meantime is going to be up to them, I'm afraid. Do the versions have the same URL path? There's support for, I believe we have custom URL slugs for both the article and the publication. I could be wrong about that. The primary URL you'll be using for this, though, is the article landing page without the version ID specified. And what that will do is that will take you to the most recent version, which is what most users will want. They'll want to be taken to the most relevant content, then be able to browse back to older pieces of content. This is also a good future-proof way of linking, because if you want to publish an early version and you know you'll have revisions, you want to make sure that you're giving a URL that's going to allow for folks to access the more recent revisions directly. So the landing URL for it does not include the version. But if you do want to share a specific version, then you can use the full version, the full URL to the publication as well. Migration process for old articles in JATS XML. That's a very good question. I'll see if I can summarize that quickly. So the ORE website that currently exists, as I say, it uses F1000, and they make available HTML-based publication, PDF-based, and also JATS. And we actually use the JATS as the current import process when we move the content into OJS. That may or may not change, but we are already ingesting it, and that's one of our sources of truth for that. In OJS 3.5, there's already a new feature that most of you will not have kind of used if you're using older versions of OJS that allows for you to upload a JATS document or to generate one from the OJS metadata. What we'll likely do is with the existing JATS documents is we'll ingest those into the JATS storage area as pre-existing documents. But then as much as possible, we're going to enrich the JATS ecosystem within OJS to allow for a complete JATS document to be generated on demand, so that you don't have to kind of create externally and then persist that document where there might be a conflict between, let's say, titles, authors, metadata, between what exists in the JATS and what exists in the OJS database. Rather, it'd be better to have OJS on demand create a complete JATS document that comes from the source of truth, which is the OJS database. So what will likely happen with the ORE corpus is those 800, 900 articles will be preserved as uploads, but then for future workflows, the JATS will be generated on demand with caching, of course. Okay. I see. Can you update about the large database and compatibility? Yeah, so we're doing some work right now on 3.5 and optimization. The 3.5 release is currently fairly slow on large corpora, and it's a known problem. I'm working on that right now. And I would say in the 350-2 release, there's a couple of small optimizations, and then 350-3 will definitely contain some of those as well. And all of those changes for 3.5 are also going to be ported forward into 3.6. The challenge with that is that the submission listing that got rewritten for 3.5 is very rich. It provides a lot of information. And so we did a lot of work on how to fetch that information in a way that would scale to large corpora without starting to degrade in performance. And I'd say late in the 3.5 dev cycle, a regression made it in there that caused performance to, again, not be that good. So it shouldn't be a really fundamental problem we have to solve. It should be a couple of queries that we have to fix somewhere. But among our many priorities, it just hasn't been something we've been able to quite crack just yet. So there will be an improved release of 3.5, and 3.6 will also be a lot faster. When do we expect a release for 3.6, and should one wait to upgrade from an earlier version or go for 3.5? Good questions. So 3.6 is scheduled for release next year, and we have a release strategy right now of alternating between long-term support LTS releases and non-LTS releases. So 3.5 is going to be an LTS release. We're going to flag it as LTS with probably the -3 release when that comes out. Once we're sure that it's going to be, a reliable upgrade process and it's going to satisfy most folks. So things like that performance issue that we know is there. If you're starting from scratch with 3.5, you're probably not going to run into it. But if you're upgrading a large data set, then you might run into performance problems. So once those are cleared up and we know that things are running smoothly, then we'll add the LTS stamp to 3.5. And it'll be a signal to the community that everybody running 3.3 should upgrade to 3.5 and that they can trust that as a reliable piece of software to run for the next 3 to 5 years. As I say, we alternate between LTS and non-LTS branches. So 3.5 is LTS, 3.6 will not be LTS, 3.7 will be LTS. And I think that's an appropriate thing for us to do because if we're going to have folks use LTS branches for a window of 3 to 5 years, then that means a long kind of maintenance window for us. And if we're working on some more kind of rapidly changing features, the non-LTS branches give us a chance to be able to kind of work on those and communicate to the community that if they want those features, if they want to use them, then it's available to them, but it'll be a shorter maintenance window. We're likely to mothball those releases after kind of a 2-3 year kind of window and expect folks will upgrade to the next LTS designated release. Essentially the question of whether or not you should upgrade to it, if you have limited technical resources and you don't need those cutting edge features, then I would recommend staying with the LTS branch, which will be 3.5 and then 3.7. If you are really enticed by the idea of the preprint workflow or the typesetting workflow, then 3.6 is going to be a stable, usable, reliable release, but you can expect that we'll be releasing kind of more fixes and updates to it. So you can expect to do more kind of small updates between just to make sure that things are working correctly. There's a lot of new features, and there's a lot of room for us to then, identify and fix subsequent bugs, basically. I'm just going to check and see if there's anything in the Q&A tool. There's one question there. How do articles published under continuous publication appear in the archives and homepage of the journal? That's a good question, and I'm going to answer that by just going to the screen share again. Give a moment to start that up. Here it is. Okay, so I'll go to the homepage of this installation here. And you can see here that we have, since I deleted the issues, we only have the thematic organization here. So I can browse this to get into thematic areas. And if those were identified in the metadata of each submission, be able to see a listing of what's in those. I have not published anything into these thematic organizations. They look empty, but you can imagine that if you had stuff published under computer vision, you'd see a listing of different articles there. That is the commonest way of doing a large collection, is this thematic approach. If I go into the journal settings, though, actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset my installation back to its default data set, which does have issues, so I can show you all 3 examples. Just give me a second. My database is just reloading. And then I'm going to, once this is finished, Bear with me a second. Okay, there we go. So if I reload this now, you'll see that we have a typical homepage where you've got current issues listed here. Table of contents is there. There's only two articles right now, but no big deal. If I now log in, I'll go into some editor role and go into the settings. I have these three main options here to control how I control access. I'm going to turn on all three options here. This is going to be a little messy, but it'll give you a sense for what's possible. I'll go to the home page. And you'll see here that we have the thematics and we have the table of contents. I don't have most recent published articles. I think that's because we're only listing those that don't have issues. But if you did have some that were published issue lists, you'd see them listed here in their kind of date order. So it's up to you to organize how you want this to appear. I think most of you who want to have this workflow are either going to do pure continuous publications, so you'll use just the thematic areas. You can browse those however you like. Or you'll do kind of a hybrid model where you have preprints without issues and then the published version of record in issues. So in that case, you'll see, let's just go in to make this a bit more interesting. I'm going to rush a preprint through so it does show something there. Let's go to something in submission. I'll schedule it. We'll have issue lists. So it'll be a preprint. And then we're done. So now if I go back to the home page, you should see that I've got, yeah. So this is the issue list preprint that I've just posted. And then we have the current table of contents. What you'll see is that if I go into the archives, this is just the issue listing. So we will not see any reflection of the preprints there. But you might see preprints either on the home page here where we've listed, or you'll see them listed under the thematic categories if we've used those. Of course, it's also possible to find them through the search engine. And this has actually become a bit of a browser interface as well. So you'll see that not only does it give us search filtering, but it also shows us all the different articles with no search term added at all. So there currently is no indication here that this is just a preprint. We might add that to the default theme so that you can see right from the get-go that this is not the same as the rest. But you can, of course, browse in and see this is a preprint form. I think that answers your question, but I'll just review it to make sure. A couple more in Q&A here. So it's possible to have an issue structure and a thematic structure simultaneously to create thematic collections parallel to traditional issue-based publishing, or is the category function the best way to do this? Yeah, it's completely up to you to choose. And once again, there is no way to say in setup, I'm doing issues or I'm doing thematic. You simply create the content and you designate it to issues or to thematic categories if you want to. And if you choose to present on the homepage your listing of thematic categories, then it'll work that way. The idea is that you can mix and match this however you want to, rather than having us prescribe pathways A, B, or C, and then have to maintain those blurry boundaries when folks want kind of a mix and match of each one. I don't see any additional questions on the chat or in the Q&A. Oh, wait, how do articles? Yeah, I think I've covered the questions in the Q&A as well. I'll pause for a minute, see if anybody's got any additional questions to add. You can always catch us on the support forum. We'll be posting this video on our YouTube channel as well, and you're welcome to ask questions on that. So there's lots of ways of getting a hold of us if you want to ask questions that come to mind later, or if you'd like to kind of follow up in more depth. The support forum is probably the best way to get a hold of us on this stuff. And we really invite folks to participate in that sort of thing because it helps us to understand that we are or are not capturing community needs that way. And I will say that this approach to mixing preprints into the OJS article workflow, it's causing us to kind of cut our teeth on a bunch of new questions. And so we probably aren't going to get everything right the first time. The more that you can get us feedback early on in the process, the better for us as well. So I really encourage you to ask questions and chat with us about this. This is all, everything I've demonstrated is in the main branch of OJS currently, and that is quite usable. So if anyone wants to spin it up and give it a test themselves, they're welcome to. And if that helps to motivate some questions, then those are welcome. And of course, it's open source. So if you have any proposals for change or any additions to make to it, then you're totally welcome. I will wrap it up there, but thanks again for joining us. And again, just a plug to keep an eye out for additional workshops like this to get posted. I know having kind of 52 of you on here is a privilege for us to be able to talk to you, and we're hoping to get some excitement and also some feedback on this fairly early. And I want to again give credit to the Open Research Europe project for allowing us to do all this work. The European Commission saw some potential in this and extended us a great vote of confidence and trust, and we are doing our best to make sure that it's borne out by the software. Thanks, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.